Welcome to the Jenna Ellis Show, sponsored by Legacy Precious Metals. There has never been a better time to invest in precious metals. Visit LegacyPMInvestments.com. That's LegacyPMInvestments.com. I'm Jenna Ellis. Join me tonight on Jenna Ellis Tonight on the Salem News Channel, and it's Friday, so we are going to tackle some bigger philosophical questions that conservatives really need to tackle. The West is falling, and we're not just talking about America, our rule of law, weaponization of government, but looking more broadly at institutions that are being captured by leftist Marxist ideology. That includes the United Nations, it includes the WEF. James Lindsey, who is a brilliant author at New Discourses, is going to join me to talk about his really important speech from Geneva. And then also Professor Giordano, who is a campus reform fellow, is going to talk about the capturing of higher education and why higher education needs to go back to actually teaching, not just indoctrinating. All of this and more coming up here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. Join me 9 p.m. Salem News Channel. Good evening and welcome to Jenna Ellis Tonight. So this week we have been focused on what is going on within our country and all of the congressional hearings, all the top trending headlines that affect our country. But let's take a step back and look globally. There are still a lot of existential concerns that are challenging the West as a whole and our way of life. And James Lindsey is one of those that speaks very prolifically on this topic. And he had a great speech about the evil organization that is the United Nations right outside of the United Nations headquarters in Geneva. This is what he had to say.
Thank you all for being here. We stand in front of the global headquarters of one of the most evil organizations ever to curse this planet, and I'm here to condemn it. We may as well be making this event in Red Square in 1934, or before the Chancellery of Berlin in 1944, or in Tiananmen Square in 1954, because the ambition of Geneva in 2024 is the same. Their ambition is to control the world with a global tyranny and a global religion called sustainability and inclusion. This vision was first articulated by a former Assistant Secretary General of this organization named Robert Mueller, who laid out a vision leading up to the Millennium Assembly 25 years ago, not just for a global tyranny, but for the United Nations to seize control of the entire evolution of man and the evolution of Earth. That cannot be. He put forth this vision believing that the world is a meta-organism. The nations of the world, the ecosystems of the world are like organs of a single body. The people, the plants, the animals are like its cells. And for them, the United Nations will be its central nervous system, its brain, the center of its soul. Obviously, we will have to sacrifice our sovereignties, national and individual, to achieve this vision, this evil, demonic vision, and we must say no. The Sustainable Development Goals show that this has crystallized and was taken seriously, and we come to Geneva to say no, we will not go with you. We will not allow this. Absolutely not. Our sovereignty is sacred. We cannot give it, and you cannot take it from us. But to the United Nations, I give a warning. That is not a building of glass and steel and concrete. That is Babel. And God shall not be mocked. Their judgment is coming. Thank you.
James Lindsey, an author at New Discourses, joins me now. So James, very, very powerful speech. And you ended with a theological premise about harkening back to Genesis and why that particular reference. I mean, this was such a powerful message.
I mean, it's very obvious that what they're attempting to build, whatever the story in Genesis represents, whether it be literally true or a cautionary tale, what the story in Genesis represents is that when you try to build a single global central nervous system, if you will, a single global entity that's going to control everything, that you are badly on the path of error. And I don't know for sure, as we've discussed many times between us, what God means, but I'm sure that I'm right that God will not be mocked in this way. And so this is a warning. I think that the United Nations, in this case, we were specifically addressing the WHO, the World Health Organization, as a subsidiary to the United Nations, has vastly overstepped its purview. It's not there to coordinate treaties and issues between nations and among nations any longer. It's now there in order to try to push a global tyrannical vision. I quite literally mean a global religious vision centered with them. And this is something that the Bible warns about repeatedly, and whether it's in Genesis, the first book, or Revelation, the last, that this is not something that will be stood for. And I think it's up to us to declare that and let them know that's how we understand, and that's what we're going to do.
Yeah, and I love that reference because, in Genesis with the Tower of Babel, that was exactly what the people were trying to do, was build a tower to become God, essentially. And then the story goes that that was when God confused all of their languages and said, no, we're going to divide. And when you look at Revelation, which is the end of all things, and there are, of course, different eschatological views of the end of all things among theologians. The premise there is that there will be a one world government, and that does harken back to Babel in Genesis. And so, we're seeing kind of this arc of the narrative. And you're right, God Himself says, "I will not be mocked." And so that I take that and I believe that because God Himself said it. But when we talk about the necessity of sovereignties and of nations, the left would suggest that we're overplaying our hand, or we are kind of overinflating what they're trying to do, because don't we want to be sustainable? Don't we want to make sure that Mother Earth is good? Aren't we opposed to climate change? And they have kind of all of these benign theories, but it's so much more sinister than that. And so why should Americans in particular, but the West as a whole, understand that sovereignties and nations still matter?
Yeah, well, the central control doesn't work. It doesn't work in a practical sense. It doesn't work in a spiritual sense. It doesn't work in any sense. And so, what the United Nations wants to do is to say, well, we need a sustainable plan for the planet. Well, look at the world. Look at these major Western republics like the United States, and actually how little, given their energy consumption and output and population, how little waste they produce, how little pollution compared to the rest of the world. They lie to you at these statistics. It turns out that the best way to solve these problems is by allowing people who, if they are problems at all, and when problems actually exist. I think we all agree that plastic going in the ocean's a problem, for example. Maybe we're less clear on whether or not CO2 emissions are a problem. But the best way to solve these problems is to let the people close to these problems innovate and come up with solutions. The best way to deal with resource depletion or resource limitation is to allow a market that generates higher costs and more challenge as you approach resource limits, forcing innovation. Every major step of growth in humanity, whether population growth, whether expansion, whatever else, has been the result of technological innovations that have come through the necessity of running up against problems. And so what they want to do is say, no, that'll never work. Just give us the control, give us the power, give us containment of all of this, and we're going to shrink our economies. It's a degrowth model. We're going to shrink our economies. We're going to shrink GDP. We're going to shrink output, and we're going to find this sustainable circular economy where we're just going to control everything. And what this requires is to smash what it fundamentally means to be human. It means making a global tyranny to force people to try to make this program work, which will not work. And like I said, they are doing this through a global value system or a global religion of sustainability and inclusion that's supposed to make people, do their part voluntarily. But those words don't mean what they sound like they mean. And their ambition is not to help the planet or to help people. It is to use those things as excuses to gain power. And we can all see that now.
And there are so many more organizations. I mean, not only the United Nations and some of these other government funded organizations, but also the WHO, the WEF. I mean, all of these things that are very organized to achieve this kind of leftist utopia. The right seems to not be nearly so organized. Why is that such a big problem and I think a fault on the part of conservatives?
Well, it turns out communists are good at organization, and of course, when we mention these organizations that are implementing this plan, we can't neglect to name, I think, the biggest, which is bigger than the United Nations in this case, which is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP. The CCP is behind much of this. The CCP, for example, when we talk about the power grab happening with the international health regulations, that got forced through in Geneva that very same day that we protested outside of the building. This IHR got forced through at the WHO by Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Tedros Ghebreyesus was placed in his position at the WHO effectively at the behest of Beijing. And so it's very important to understand that the Chinese Communist Party is behind this. But the reason that conservatives are less organized is because we tend to solve societal problems like I was describing, kind of emergently. We allow people to deal with the problems closest to them, to figure out how to add value to a situation, to solve problems that they understand. And we don't try to do these giant globally coordinated pushes to seize power that we don't know how to handle or wield. There's a certain humility among us. So we stay disorganized, and they're very organized. But like I said at the end of my speech, I think they've now crossed a line to where, whether it's just that people see it and don't trust them, and so in that sense, God will not be mocked, this thing's going to fall apart for them, I think, at this juncture.
I hope that it does. And, how would you encourage the people watching to get engaged and to ensure that this kind of regime ultimately fails?
Well, you need to get informed and you need to speak. The thing that the communist program historically has always feared the most is exposure. When people understand that they are not there to actually promote sustainability or there to promote inclusion or any social good, anti-racism, LGBTQ inclusion, whatever the value system that they push it, when people understand that they're not actually there to promote that, but they are there to use that as an excuse to manipulate people into giving them power, they lose their ability to steal that power and to wield that power. And then we can start to make progress at accountability for what they've already stolen, what they've already damaged. So what I encourage people to do is to pick some topic within this, whether it's the United Nations or the WHO, whether it's something to do with your local school board or your kids individually, and get informed enough to get involved, to understand the issues and fight back against them. Join in organizations. The Sovereignty Coalition, for example, is fighting this with the United Nations and its junction with the CCP and the WHO. You can get involved in that and get informed, start listening to the people who are already speaking, read up on the issues. There are thousands of documents that we need people reading and exposing to the world, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, I think that's really smart advice because a lot of people feel like they can't get involved in everything. They can't solve all of the world's problems, so they just sit back and they do nothing. But if you just get engaged in at least one thing, if everyone who is still conservative in this country and in the West would do that, then we would see a broader coalition and would actually bring about more change and going on the offense. So James Lindsey, author at New Discourses, always so appreciate your insights. I always say he is probably the smartest man that I know. So we'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. So, as we continue to talk about the West falling and the ideological underpinnings of liberalism that has infiltrated so much of our student life, we can turn to universities and see that universities are actually acting as activist ideological indoctrination camps rather than just teaching philosophy and the worldview of conservatism and the real theology that a lot of these universities were founded on as seminaries. There's a great op-ed in The Hill earlier last week that said this: activism is not the mission of universities. Americans' confidence in higher education was already at historic lows, just 36%, and we can anticipate that it is likely to plummet further. These institutions must refocus on their core mission: critical thinking, scholarship, and merit. If they do this, they may be able to reclaim their integrity and rebuild trust. If not, they will continue their decline into irrelevancy. So Nicolas Giordano is a professor at a community college and also a campus reform higher education fellow, and he joins me now. You're the author of this op-ed, and I think you're absolutely right, Professor.
Thank you for having me, Jenna.
Yeah. So, where did this decline really start, where universities turned into this type of political activist indoctrination camp rather than actually teaching students how to think and how to think critically?
Well, I think there were two big moments in the education system as a whole. One of them was the idea of STEM. So we downgraded the teaching of civics and writing and literature for the sciences and mathematics and tech. Unfortunately, that's led to an entire student body that knows very little about the United States. It knows very little about America and American history. Just 13% of students demonstrate proficiency in American history, and only 22% of students demonstrate proficiency in civics. So you have a student generation that has gone through more schooling than any previous generation, yet it seems they know less. And at the same time, we've had ideologues replace educators. So it used to be that the people teaching in the classrooms were the subject matter experts. I mean, I had Marxist professors when I was going to college, but they had an appreciation for education. They liked the debate and dialogue. They were subject matter experts in their field, and they could answer any questions and engage. However, what we've seen is a movement away from subject area expertise. And what they lack in the subject material, they have now replaced with ideology. And it's why I wrote the piece, because what we're witnessing is a bunch of politicians, college administrators, and even faculty members that have forgotten what the higher education system is all about. They promote this idea of activism. And that has nothing to do with higher education. Higher education is about instilling the ability to think critically, getting the students to be able to problem solve, have them engage civically and be productive members of our society and be productive within the workplace. We've deviated from that, and it's clear. We see it every day because our institutions are suffering.
Yeah, so well said. And it's mainly because of this Marxist ideology and a lot of these professors that are purposefully and intentionally trying to indoctrinate their students instead of teaching them subject matter expertise and how to critically think and be a productive member of society in a given field. I mean, that's what education should have been about. And so how do we start kind of winding that back and having a model of universities back to where it should be?
Well, at Campus Forum, we've been very critical of the whole diversity, equity, inclusion push. I think that we need to abolish it from the education system as a whole, because what we see is that diversity, equity, inclusion has nothing to do with diversity or inclusion or even equity. Really, what it has to do with is a leftist political agenda, and that's where you get them training activists as opposed to educating students. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be done. But I think some of the universities are beginning to wake up to some of the problems that the diversity, equity, inclusion model has created. You know, when you have students screaming about intifada and chanting death to America and death to Israel, many have seen it's gone too far. And we see schools like University of North Carolina start to defund their DEI programs. What's happened is there's been an enormous amount of pressure. They've been exposed. So you have employers that are now doing away with 4-year degree programs. You have parents and students that are now questioning whether or not getting a 4-year degree is worth it. They have lost faith in the higher education system. And then you have the donor class that has now begun to pull back its funds. And so universities are going to have to make a very tough decision. Are they going to continue with the ideological indoctrination and brainwashing that has been taking place for the last 2 decades? Or will they get back to the core of their mission, actually instill values and work ethics, merit, still instill scholarship and the search for truth? Or are they going to remain ideological? And I think that question's up in the air. But there is hope, because what we are seeing, we watch the 4-year Ivy League university campuses. What we don't pay attention to is the community college campuses. If you look at the community colleges, we haven't seen this level of protest. We haven't seen students commandeer buildings and take over the campuses, shut down classes. And the reason being is because the student body at a community college is more in touch with reality. Many of them work full time. They may have children that they take care of, elderly parents, or they're adults returning to the school to get a better position at the workplace. And so they're more serious about their education. They don't live in that groupthink mentality like the 4-year university campus. And it shows that there are students that do want to learn, that can engage. In my classroom, I have yet to have a debate that devolves and students are disrespecting each other. They conduct themselves well. They treat each other with respect. They respect each other's arguments, even though they could disagree with each other. And I think that we should focus more on the community colleges and what they're doing, as opposed to the university bubble that's created the cultural rot in the first place.
Wow, isn't that an amazing observation? I mean, and if you talk to the average student, they don't want to go to a community college. They'd rather go to Ivy League just because that's more impressive to some of these, to be a graduate of an elite institution because of some of these other employers, when really it sounds like you're getting a far superior education, especially among the discussion with your professors and your colleagues in some of the lesser known and maybe less prestigious institutions. But that's where the education is actually occurring. And so just in the last 2 minutes I have with you, Professor, are there any incentives for these Ivy League institutions to stop being so ideological and return to actual education?
Yes, obviously, tuition dollars, that's what talks. And if students aren't applying to these schools and we start to see enrollment drops, well, change the institution's behavior. As I said, I think the donor class is the one that plays a very big role, because if the donor class pulls back, that's going to hurt the endowments of these universities. But there's one other thing, and that's after witnessing what's been taking place on some of these campuses over the last 6 months. There have been several announcements from employers that they will not hire students from these schools. And I think that also plays a big role, because if I'm a student that's now applying to these universities, well, I'm going to rethink where I'm going, because ultimately, at the end of the day, they want to get jobs. They want to get a career once they graduate after spending all that money. And so I think that will force the institutions to change their behavior. The question is, how much damage have they inflicted so far, and whether or not it's too much at this point, whether or not they can reverse the trend. And I think that remains to be seen.
Yeah, really well said. And so the op-ed is in the Hill, and Professor Giordano, really appreciate your insights here. And hopefully, for all of the students that are considering this, you want an education more than you want to be indoctrinated. And so you'll make some of those decisions based on what you really want for your life, and knowing that you don't want to sit under Marxist tutelage. But really appreciate your time, Professor. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. Well, speaking of ideology, former President Trump was asked about his and his faith in God on Fox and Friends Sunday, and Jon Root posted this clip to his X account. Listen to this.
Relationship with God like, and how do you pray? That's Sharon from Alabama.
Okay, so I think it's good. I do very well with the evangelicals. I love the evangelicals. And I have more people saying they pray for me. I can't even believe it. And they are so committed, and they're so believing. They say, "Sir, you're going to be okay. I pray for you every night." I mean, everybody, almost. I can't say everybody, but almost everybody that sees me, they say it. It's such a beautiful thing. You know what's a beautiful thing too? When you look at all of this bad stuff going on, they have nothing to look up to. They have no God. They have no anything. They kill people, they beat people, they push people into subways. There's just nothing there. Religion is such a great thing. It keeps you, there's something to be good about. You want to be good. It's so important, and I don't know if it's explained right. I don't know if I'm explaining it right now, but when you have something like that, you want to be good. You want to go to heaven, okay? You want to go to heaven. If you don't have heaven, you almost say, what's the reason?
Yeah.
Why do I have to be good? Let's not be good. What difference does it make? Right? Or they try to create heaven here.
Jon Root is a cultural and political commentator, and he joins me now. So, Jon, you and I are both Christians. We are evangelicals. What was your response to President Trump's commentary?
Well, I was just timing it again, Jenna, and I think I heard about a minute and a half of a non-answer. It's just every single time, like, we can give Trump his praises, we can stand up for him against the political persecution, but when it comes to his faith, and I think there was another Fox News town hall fairly recently over the last year, and he got a similar question. It's just like, tell us about your faith, and all he does is talk about how people are praying for him, how the evangelical community stands up for him and votes for him. We're not getting a clear answer. at all. And all we're looking for is kind of like a First Peter 3:15 model, like have a defense for the hope that you have. What's your prayer life like? Do you actually pray? Do you have any sort of connection with God through a church? Anything like that? We're never getting a clear answer from him. And I think it's such a bummer because people like you and I and millions of other Christians are actually looking for a legitimate answer to these legitimate questions.
Yeah, and I think that these are important questions. And, we may say that it ultimately doesn't matter in the grand scheme of politics when we look at, are we going to vote for, Trump or the communist? And that's a pretty clear answer, I think, for most evangelicals. But for Trump to just pivot to saying, to the politics and saying, the evangelicals love me, rather than talking about his own personal faith when he himself identifies as a Christian, that is troubling. And I think that it does go deeper into kind of this mindset that he won't be personal. And how much more do you think it would resonate with true Christians if he was just open about his own personal faith?
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of you're afraid to say the wrong thing, but when you see a pattern of Trump continually dodging these legitimate questions, like there's videos out there of people asking him, like, what's your favorite Bible verse? And he won't answer the question. And these are very simple questions. So a lot of people are always going to reply and say, I'm not voting for a pastor in chief. I'm voting for a commander in chief. And you fail to recognize the fact that Donald Trump is constantly dodging these questions, these very simple questions. Like, Jenna, if someone comes up to you or I and they say, what's your favorite Bible verse? What's your prayer life like? What's your relationship with God like? We might have a different answer depending on the period of life that we're going through, the season, whatever it may be, but we always have an answer for that. So the fact that he can ramble on for a minute and a half, he doesn't tell people what his favorite Bible verse is, and he constantly just turns this into some sort of political pitch. And I think mostly, Jenna, it's like, this is selfish. It's always a politically, selfishly motivated answer. And I think that's really disheartening to me. Obviously, again, Biden's a joke. So people can say, oh,
Yeah.
well, it's not as bad as Biden doing the sign of the cross at a pro-abortion rally. Of course, it is not as bad as that, but we
Right.
can still.
But I think you're right, because our Christianity is central to who we are. And we would just like to see a little more from President Trump. We'll be right back with more after this. The border and the economy remain the two most critical issues facing Americans heading into November. And of course, you wouldn't know that listening to the mainstream media's chatter that just wants to talk about Trump versus Biden as personalities. And of course, convicted felon versus, dementia patient, basically. I mean, in that instance, I'm going with the convicted felon, right? And yet, we should be talking about policy. Policy matters. And what values and what policy are we as Americans going to vote for headed into November? And that should not matter whether you are a Republican, a Democrat, or anything else. All of this ultimately affects you as an American living in our society today. So this headline coming from Bloomberg that says the majority of middle-class Americans say they struggle financially. Majority of people feel financially insecure in this survey. A third of respondents feel extreme stress about paying debt. Joining me now to discuss is Tho Bishop, who is a content creator at the Mises Institute. And Tho, I resonate with this headline. I mean, I think I'm probably part of middle-class America, and I know that my grocery bill has gone up, and there are so many other things and rent increases. I mean, so many things that are just costing more and more money. And so the income that everyday Americans are getting is actually being less. And it will go so much, it won't go as far as it used to because of Bidenflation and some of these things. And yet the Democrats would love to not talk about this headed into November. The debate is coming up very soon. How important of a role do you think that the economy should play at that debate?
Well, we're already seeing right now that inflation is the number one issue that is motivating voters. I mean, particularly with younger voters, I think this explains the softness of Biden's numbers with some of the usual Democratic coalitions there. The problem is that, when it comes to the policy side of things, ultimately, until you start getting serious about the spending side of the equation, it's very difficult to address some of these underlying issues here, because the problem is we've got a very high debt in society right now, both government debt, but also just consumer debt. We've had a very high inflationary period, which led to the rising of interest rates, which compounds that problem. The Fed is trying to find any reason they can to lower numbers. The problem is inflation has been sticky. And so what you have is a political class that keeps focusing on these aggregated statistics, which are kind of built to gaslight the public so that the economic hardships that they're feeling personally, they're trying to confuse it with headlines about how great the economy is. You still hear this from the Biden administration. It's like, oh, well, Americans just aren't appreciating how great the economy is. And, oh, look how we are relative to the rest of the world. Well, the problem is that, Americans have been living in a period of relative abundance, have been living in a time of relatively cheap debt. It's inflated the price of your house, the price of financial assets and the like. Well, now that you have the housing market stagnating, now that you have, again, higher interest rate payments for the debt that you have, now that you have inflation, which has gone down from its peak based off of the government statistics. But the problem is that a 3.5 inflation number is not, that's still rising prices. And all of the price inflation that we saw several years ago is still baked in the pie, right? So this is why food prices are up 20% from what it was, in 2020 and things like that. These are very, very real problems. And there's not a simple policy fix. And since both sides have been complicit on the federal spending side of things, both sides have been complicit on the environmental factors that have led to the situation. I expect to get a lot of rhetoric about, I can make the economy better, I can all this sort of stuff. But when it comes to actual policy side of things, there still is not a serious appetite to deal with what has actually created the hardships that Americans are facing right now.
Yeah, it's the Biden administration continues to project, don't believe your lying grocery receipts. The economy is doing well. And I think you're right to suggest that these talking points and this rhetoric is just gaslighting the American public. But so many people are not really that well versed on economic topics enough to know where the disconnect is between all of these promises that are made at the debates and on commercials and on social media and what they're actually experiencing in their everyday lives. And so how can conservatives, and in particular Donald Trump, as he heads into that debate, really tailor this so that Americans can understand exactly what the Biden administration's policy is so that they can decide for themselves whether they want to vote for that or not?
Well, I think the strength for Donald Trump right now is, again, that Americans are feeling this. This is why, in spite of how many times, a corporate press article can use the words convicted felon in it, we've seen that, even post conviction, Donald Trump is winning, in national public polls, right? And if you have a Republican that actually wins, the national popular vote, then what that's going to translate to the Electoral College is going to be even bigger, because again, we've only had one Republican victory of the popular vote in modern political history at this point. This is why you've seen massive draining in a lot of those swing states. And so even things that you would think historically would push away, say, suburban women, which Donald Trump has always had a problem with, right? Certain demographic groups that have never been particularly eager for Trump for whatever reason, they're not breaking even after a federal conviction because of what is going on with their day-to-day lives and economy. And that's why inflation is like the number one populist issue, because it's one of those ways that you can feel how the system is ripping you off on a daily basis. And again, this is why it's so frustrating that we can complain about inflation. Politicians will complain about inflation, but when it comes to actually trying to identify what is necessary to address that, things get a little murky. Donald Trump had an interview this week with Fox Business. There's a lot of good stuff in there, right? Obviously focusing on the energy side of it, that could play a major role, right? The stalling American energy production certainly did not help. That's a very easy, kind of low-hanging fruit issue. But he was pushed on, how can you be more like Milei down in Argentina, where you've already seen massive decrease in inflation down there. And ultimately, that's going to require dealing with the spending side of things. So he's talked about, abolishing the Department of Education, some of these departments, or at least massively throttling down. That is what needs to happen in practice, not simply in rhetoric, begin to start addressing some of these real core issues that's driving this hardship that, again, Americans are facing right now.
Yeah, really well said. And so everyone is also waiting for Donald Trump to announce his vice presidential pick. And do you think that a potential VP pick could help influence some of the concerns and be able to speak to those in maybe some ways also that resonate with the American people, depending on who that pick is?
I'd love to see a Rand Paul as a vice president. I think that he would be a lot more affluent on some of these issues, given how much his dad has focused on that side of things for quite some time. I'm not expecting that. So I'm a little skeptical about the extent to which a VP, based on the names out there, is going to really help bolster the economic side of things beyond some of that cheap rhetoric. But hey, Vivek Ramaswamy is someone who's talked about the Fed a lot, so I would certainly appreciate his perspective dealing with some of these serious issues.
Yeah, and there's a poll that I referred to earlier this week in the show that said that Gen Zers think of all politicians kind of by writ large as corrupt and really not addressing some of their most pressing concerns. And as we get, Gen Z is a rising demographic and huge voting bloc, along with millennials that I think are still currently the largest voting bloc. How much of this is important, especially when you have younger people not affording homes, not being able to live the American dream? I mean, are they just content to continue renting for the rest of their lives and have, minimum wage paying jobs and just say, okay, well, Biden's great because, he's promised to forgive my student loans? I mean, this doesn't seem to really be resonating.
No, and I think that a lot of the ways the left has really leaned in the culture war, really since the Obama era itself, was kind of a response to Occupy Wall Street and some of that growing, kind of left-wing populist sentiment about the economic system. Well, they're getting kind of too close to the core there. Not that I support everything that Occupy Wall Street was talking about, but that's where you started seeing a massive change on the cultural issues. We have to have, talk about Pride Month all the time and try to have these sort of social justice narratives that distract from these core economic things. Again, I think that is losing its cachet, particularly with Generation Z right now, based off of what we're seeing in opinion polls. But really, this is a very fascinating global dynamic. You're seeing it with the UK right now, and one of the reasons why the Conservative Party is completely tanking, and the reason why Nigel Farage is really leaning into trying to attract younger Britons that are recognizing the extent to which their economic hardships are not being appreciated, and they're doubling down, like protecting pensioners over there at the expense of the younger generation. Again, a lot of our policy things here, again, like propping up the price of housing in order to keep your net worth, right? That's really good if you own a house, right? That's really good if you're at the point in your life where you have those assets. If you're not there yet, then you're the one getting hurt the most. And so I think there's a very interesting opportunity if you can tap into this generational resentment based off of the policies that have really hurt younger generations. That, I think, is something that could really change politics. I'd be interested to see if Nigel Farage can pull that off in the UK, and be interested to see who can step up in that role here in the US.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great analysis, that this isn't just an issue for America, but this is really Western culture in particular that has seen the left really focusing on the LGBTQ rainbow mafia culture issues and really not honing in on what's actually important to their citizens. So, Bishop, thanks so much. We'll be right back with more here on Jenna Ellis Tonight. And finally tonight, the leftist rainbow mafia may have finally overplayed their hand. This headline saying that the United Methodist Church is losing a lot of members. More than 1 million United Methodists quit the church overnight after sex rule change. The UMC bishops approved gay pastors and same-sex marriage in the U.S. early May. The Ivory Coast division of the church responded by defecting on May 28th. Leader Bishop Benjamin Boney blasted the umbrella church for siding with LGBT. So joining me now is Walker Wildmon, who is the vice president of the American Family Association and host of At the Core on American Family Radio Network, where I also host Jenna Ellis in the morning. So Walker, this is Pride Month, and I was really grateful also to see that there were a number of NFL teams that just declined to participate. This is a good thing. Are we maybe seeing some rolling back in culture, but especially the church?
Yeah, I think so. I think people are fed up, if you will, with the overt sexualization of our society, especially our children. I mean, they've made it to where it's not just June. For them, it's every month is Pride Month. I mean, President Biden comes out with this Transgender Day of Visibility. What? I didn't even know it existed, and he decided to drop it on Good Friday. How ironic. So yeah, people are over this, and it's not just Christians, just average people who don't want this LGBTQ junk shoved in their face every day. They're over it as well. They're like, isn't there more to this world than so-called Pride Month? But when it comes to the Methodist Church, my grandfather, Don Wildmon, was a longtime Methodist pastor before they went woke. And he fought the Methodist Church back in the 70s and 80s on some of these very, very same subjects. But when you disregard biblical teachings, you're going to have problems. And that's what the United Methodist Church is having now. They're having major problems. But the frustration is, if you're going to call yourself a Christian denomination and say that you believe in the Bible and you believe in God and you believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, then you need to adopt the whole teachings of Scripture. Otherwise, just don't be a believer. Don't be a Christian. Be an atheist. Be an unbeliever, agnostic, whatever you want to be. But the problem is this is a mainline Christian denomination, but they're disregarding the teachings that they claim to hold on to. So that's the problem here, and that's why people are departing. And one last thing I'll say on this is the irony here is that some of these Christian denominations are claiming to want to appeal to the broader audience, and that's why they're going soft on some of the biblical teachings of Scripture. But instead of it bringing more people into the fold, it's actually causing more people to flee these denominations, and that's what you're just seeing with the United Methodist Church.
Yeah, so well said that if you're going to call yourself a Christian, then that means by definition you believe in what the Bible teaches and you are assenting to God's judgment being more sound perhaps than your own. I mean, there are certainly things that we can debate over what does the Bible mean in terms of certain passages. There are things that are so-called in-house debates, but the sanctity of marriage is one of them that is very clear, starting from Genesis 1 all the way through the New Testament. Jesus, of course, ratified that, so did the Apostle Paul. I mean, these are just very clear tenets of the faith. And then you even have some other denominations like the SBC, for example, that wants to say, well, in light of feminism, we want to make it so that women can be part of the ecclesia, which is clearly against the teaching of Scripture. And so there is a lot of division there. And I think you're right to pose the question, why do people want to call themselves Christians but not actually follow what the Bible teaches?
Well, there's the way of the world and the way of our flesh and the way of humanity, which always leads to unmitigated disaster. I mean, every time man says my way is the best way, it always goes south. Literally, it never ends well. And so this is the same case here. When you say, I know what God's word says, but I don't really want to follow that. I think my way's better. It always ends in disaster and destruction and division. And to your point, the Southern Baptist Convention, I mean, they're meeting next week in Indianapolis, and they're discussing whether women can be lead pastors in the church. And of course, the biblical answer to that is, of course not. When you read the teachings of the Apostle Paul and on the entirety of the New Testament, it's clear that women aren't to be lead pastors. It doesn't mean women are less than, or women can't serve in the church, or women have no contribution to the body of Christ. That's not what Scripture says. It just says that the position of the lead pastor is reserved for men, plain and simple. And so that's being debated in the Southern Baptist Convention. But the United Methodist downfall started with this very subject of whether women can be lead pastors. And 30, 40 years ago, they said, yeah, this is a great idea. Even though the Bible says no, let's make women lead pastors. Now they're debating whether marriage is between a man and a woman.
Wow. And hopefully the SBC doesn't go that far, but this just shows that if you start with rejecting some very clear commands of God in favor of saying, well, this is so offensive to women. And as a woman, I'm not offended by that. I can't be a father either, or a husband. There is some positional authority that women can't have, and likewise men. So that is actually okay, but you'll get into a slippery slope really fast. But that's all the time we have for Jenna Ellis tonight. Make it a great night and a great weekend.